Okay, my reading kids. Remember that I am gone this afternoon and tomorrow, Friday afternoon. So, what we're going to do is we are going to finish reading just the end of chapter 18 and chapter 19 today in our Among the Hidden book. And then tomorrow we'll read chapters 21 and 22. You have some questions that you're going to fill out as you listen to me read, and then Mr. Gershkin will go over the answers with you after the reading, and you guys are going to turn these in at the end of class, and they'll go in the grade book, okay? So let's get started. We are just at the part where, if you're following along, we're on page 86. Remember, they're in a chat room, and Jen is typing and Luke doesn't really know what's going on. So we're at the top of page 86, about like the first full paragraph. Jen typed quickly. No, just Among the Hidden, not the same thing at all. And then she sent it too. What is this? Luke asked. Some sort of game? He remembered Jen mentioning a Carlos before and never explaining who he was. Were these some sort of computerized imaginary friends? Carlos, Sean, Yolanda. They're all other third children. Sean's even got a brother, Pat, who's a fourth child. This is how I talk to them. Luke watched the next line of type appear. Carlos, thanks for the sympathy, Jen. But how? Luke asked, still dumbfounded. Oh, it's the net, Jen said. If you've got a spare hour or two sometime, I'll give you the technical googly-gook to explain it. All I care about is that it works. I'd die without somebody to talk to. She was typing even as she talked. Luke craned his head to see what she wrote. Guess what? The kid I told you about, Luke, is here with me. Quickly, 3 high Lukes appeared on the screen. Luke fought down panic. But the government, he said, they'll find me. Jen playfully slugged his arm. Chill, okay? Nobody from the government can get in this chat room. We all use a password. Just third children know it. And anyhow, even if someone else read this, what would they know? Just that somewhere in the world there's a kid named Luke. Big deal. But they can trace you through the computer, and then they'd find me too. Luke's heart was still pounding. Look, if they could trace people through the computer or through this chat room, wouldn't they have found me a long time ago? Jen asked. Luke tried to think clearly. Your parents, he said. You said they bribe people, so you're safe. But mine, Jen was shaking her head. No, I am not safe, she said grimly. Even my parents couldn't bribe the population police if they found me. Maybe to keep them from looking, but maybe not even that. The population police get some ridiculously big reward for every illegal they find. Why do you think I hide at all? Why do you think we have to have the rally? Everybody ought to be safe, and nobody should have to use bribes just to walk down the street or go to the mall or take a ride in a car. Luke glanced back at the computer screen where the conversation continued. How did all of those people find out the password? He asked. How did you? Well, I created the chat room, so I made it up, Jen said. And I knew a couple other shadow kids, and I got my parents and their parents to get the passwords to them. And then some of those kids spread the passwords to other kids they knew. Last time I counted, I had contact with 800 kids. Luke shook his head. He didn't think even his parents knew that many people. So what is the password? He asked. Free, Jen said. It's free. Chapter 19. Luke left Jen's that day with a pile of books and computer printouts clutched to his chest. Some reading material for you, she'd said, so you'll understand. Back in his own room, Luke sat down on his bed and opened the first book. It was thick and carried its title in ominous black letters, The Population Disaster. The type inside was small and closely spaced. Luke read a sentence at random. While debate continues over the carrying capacity of the earth, he skipped ahead. If the total fertility rate in industrialized countries had remained at below 2.1, Luke saw that reading this book would be like puzzling out letters Dad got from the government. He glanced at the other two books, The Famine Years Revisited and The Population Reversal. They looked no easier. The computer printouts were at least brief, but both The Problem of the Shadows and The Population Law, our country's biggest mistake, were full of big words. Luke sighed. He was tempted to put the books aside and just ask Jen to explain them to him, and he might have, except for what she'd said as she'd begun handing them to him. Oh my gosh, I didn't think you can read, can't you? Of course, Luke had answered stiffly. I was reading in the chat room, wasn't I? Yes, but you could have been. Oh, never mind. I've offended you again, haven't I? Me and my big mouth. It wouldn't have been anything to be ashamed of, even if you couldn't. Oh, I'm making things worse. I'll shut up. Here. And it had seemed to Luke that she'd pulled even bigger books off the shelf after that. Now he resolutely turned to the beginning of the population disaster and began reading. Since some elements of the overpopulation crisis were foreseen in the 1800s, an uninformed observer could only wonder why humankind came so near to the total annihilation, but Luke reached for the dictionary and settled in for the long haul. It rained for the next several days, so Luke read constantly, not even tempted to race over to Jen's instead. He could hear Dad banging around downstairs, stomping in and out from the barn or the machine shed. Now that the harvest was in, Luke thought Dad might be bored without the pigs to take care of. So Luke read, cautiously, always ready to shove his population book under his pillow and replace it with one of his adventure books. The preparation paid off on the fourth day when he heard Dad's footsteps on the stairs. Hey, Luke, what are you up to? Nothing, Luke said, turning the treasure island right side up at the very last moment. Dad did not notice. Do you want to play cards? They played rummy on Luke's bed. Luke could feel the corner of the population disaster poking his back throughout the entire game, and he kept wanting to ask Dad about what he was learning. He spent most of the first game biting his tongue, and Dad won. Again? Dad asked, shuffling the cards. If you don't have any work you've got to do. In November, with no livestock, only work I've got now is figuring out how we're going to pay our bills once the hog money runs out. Isn't there some way to grow stuff inside during the winter? Like down in the basement with special lights, a lot of water, and extra minerals? And then you could sell it? Luke asked without thinking. He just finished reading a chapter in the population book about hydroponics. Dad squinted. Seems I did hear tell of that once. Luke won the next hand. Dad didn't seem to be concentrating. At the end, Dad said, Do you mind if we quit now? Luke was terrified Dad would ask where he'd heard all about hydroponics, so he just said, No problem. Dad left, muttering, Growing food inside. Luke wished he'd had the nerve to ask about the population law, or the famines, or even some family history. Once he got past the dense language, the books Jen had loaned him were full of revelations. As best he could understand it, the world had simply gotten too full of people about 20 years earlier. Poor countries had it particularly bad, and people there often starved or were malnourished. But then something worse happened. Terrible droughts struck the parts of the world that always grew the most food. For 3 years, they grew almost nothing. People everywhere starved. In Luke's country, the government began rationing food, only allowing people to have 1,500 calories a day. And to make sure there was enough food, they seized control of all of the food production. They forced factories that had made junk to crank out healthy food instead. They forced farmers to move to land that would be more likely to produce. Is that why we don't live near our grandparents? Luke wanted to ask his parents that question. But the government didn't think that was enough. They wanted to make sure there would never be more people than farmers could feed. So they passed the population law too. In the evenings, spooning in his stew or cutting up his meat, Luke felt pangs of guilt now. Perhaps someone was starving someplace because of him. But the food wasn't there. Wherever the starving people were, it was here, on his plate. He ate it all. "Luke, you are so quiet lately. Is everything all right?" Mother asked one night when he waved away a second helping of cabbage. "I'm fine," he said, and went back to eating silently. But he was worrying that maybe the government was right and that he shouldn't exist. Only when he got to the 2 computer printouts did he begin to feel better. One of the articles began, "The population law is evil," and the other said, "Hundreds of children are hidden, mistreated, starved, neglected, abused, even murdered for no reason. Forcing children into the shadow can be counted as genocide." "How can this be?" he asked Jen a week later when he finally got a chance to go back to her house. "How can the books and the articles be so different?" She handed him a glass of soda. "What do you mean?" she asked. Luke pointed to the population disaster. "This book says the human race would have gone extinct if we hadn't had the population law. And this," he held up and shook the Problem of the Shadows article, "this says the population law was totally unnecessary and cruel. It says there was plenty of food, even during the famines, except that the barons were hoarding it." Belatedly, he remembered that Jen was a baron. "Sorry," he said. Jen shrugged, not the least bit offended. "So, what's the truth?" Luke asked. Jen shook potato chips into a bowl. "Well, think about it. The government allowed these books to be published. They probably even paid for them. So of course they're going to say what the government wants people to believe. They're just propaganda, lies.